Welcome to the Generative Edge, the podcast that keeps you up to date with the latest news and events in the world of generative AI. I'm Stephanie, and I'm a consultant at Deloitte Central Europe.
And I'm Brandon, the natural language processing and generative AI lead at Deloitte Central Europe. We're your trusted hosts, passionate about exploring the world of generative AI and its impact on businesses and society.
In this podcast, we dive into the exciting current events and advancements happening in the realm of generative AI.
From groundbreaking innovations to real-world applications, we'll shed light on how generative AI is shaping industries and transforming the way we do business.
No need to worry about technical jargon or feeling left out of the conversation. We'll break it all down in a way that's easy to understand and relatable to professionals across various fields. Together, we'll navigate through the rapidly evolving landscape of generative AI and highlight its business benefits and value.
And guess what? We want to hear from you too. Share your thoughts, questions, and insights with us through our community channels, and we'll make sure to address them in future episodes.
So let's dive right into this week's latest and greatest in Gen AI.
Today's episode is all about Gen AI myths, the thing you've probably heard others talk about, but weren't sure whether they were true or not.
Because generative AI is such a new and evolving topic, it's easy to believe the random things you hear about it, especially the horror stories.
Yeah, especially the horrors.
So today, we're going to bust some of the most common myths. Let's get into it. So Brandon, why don't you start us off with our first myth?
Okay, so myth number one, we've got GPT is a chatbot / robot / search engine / web scraper / general AI wizard.
Wow, that's a lot of slashes.
This is a really common misconception among the people that don't actually work with generative AI. They essentially think that it's a robot of some sort, or that it can do all sorts of stuff like search the internet or save information that it gets in the chat window, or automate your business processes, or replace people at work, and none of that actually is true. So
okay, so I mean, just to throw it out there, I've definitely heard of GPT just on its own, but then of course there's Chat GPT as well. So can you just tell us a little bit about the differences between all of these things?
Yeah, so for all intents and purposes, I understand lots of people, they might make a distinction between the word venomous and poisonous if they're studying biology, but most people, for them, it means the same thing, right? GPT, ChatGPT probably means the same thing for anybody who's not really working in AI or generative AI, but that's not the case in the field. So there is a big distinction between GPT and ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is a front-end chatbot web application developed by OpenAI that's using their underlying GPT models to basically power the chat feature. But instead of just relying on one generative model, it most likely is relying on multiple. So there's ChatGPT 3.5 and ChatGPT 4 that have the GPT-4 or whatever model underlying them. And in addition to that, there's guardrails, there's classification models, there's other web software that's actually supporting that chatbot to make sure that it works. Okay, so GPT, this can refer to a couple of different things. One, it can refer to the actual architecture of the model. So let's imagine a model is just a stack of calculators, and you can stack them in different ways. So when you build a GPT model, which stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer.
Oh, that's what it stands for.
Yeah,
okay, there we go.
Yeah. So it's a transformer model architecture, which means you stack up these calculators in a specific way, and that's the shape of a transformer model. And it's generative because it generates data that looks like it's training data, and it's pre-trained because it's pre-trained on all of this existing text data. So it learns kind of the distribution of all the words that you use in that pre-training phase, and then it generates text that looks like it, which is why it looks so human. It's based on a bunch of web text and text messages, etc. So it can generate text that looks like a human wrote it. Anyway, so GPT refers to either this general model architecture, a generative pre-trained transformer, or specifically to one of the GPT models in a GPT model family created by OpenAI.
Okay.
So OpenAI calls GPT 3.5, but it's actually it's like a product line, basically. Okay. GPT 3.5 encompasses 8 different models. There's GPT 3.5, 3.5 16K, referring to how many tokens you can put in. There's GPT-4 Turbo, because it generates stuff faster and it has a longer context window.
Woo.
Yeah, so it's really you hear GPT thousands of times in different contexts, and it could mean a different thing in all of those contexts based on what product you're talking about or what you're using it for.
So it's kind of like if you were going to say there's a car and then there's a Mercedes.
Yeah.
And then there's, I don't know, the Mercedes S-Class or something like that. So it kind of just breaks it down that way.
Exactly. Yeah. So I could say Mercedes, and I could be talking about the company or a specific car or a specific family of cars. Yeah. It's the same thing here.
So basically, I can't ask GPT to, like, I don't know, do my taxes for me or something like that.
Which GPT?
There we go.
No, yeah. You would have to build a lot of supporting software. The GPT model is only going to get you so far as text input, text output. Of course, recently there's these multimodal models, but maybe we'll save that for another episode.
So, final myth for us now. Basically, that LLMs, or large language models, can discover trends and make predictions.
Oh, God. Oh, no.
On your BS meter, how big of a BS is that?
This is off the charts. It's like totally out there.
Okay, but why? Why is it that way?
Yeah, so generative models are currently very bad at math. It's the wrong tool for looking at statistical distributions or numbers over time. Like, it may be able to discover, quote unquote, for those of you who are listening to the audio. A trend if it's a few lines long and it's generally increasing with maybe a dip or two or something very, very simple. It can get a trend in that sense. But if you're handing it 1,000 lines of an Excel table and you say, okay, tell me all of the trends in this data, it's going to give you garbage output, and it doesn't have enough attention to put on any of those tokens. And it doesn't know what you mean by trend. If I were to give it to somebody in high school and I said, what are the trends in this data? Well, they need skills. They need to understand what it means to have a statistical distribution in the first place. They need to calculate the standard deviation or maybe the seasonality of the data. So it's not a task that generative models are typically good at, but you shouldn't be using them for that kind of a task anyway. There are better traditional, more computationally efficient models in AI and linear regression, these kinds of things that are much better at looking at numbers than a generative model is.
So yeah, let's talk about that for a moment, because we definitely want to make sure that we're giving our audience like the actionable things that GenAI can help with, but also being realistic about the limitations as well. So what can GenAI do when it comes to trends and predictions and discoveries and things like that? So are we talking about pairing things together with other existing technology? Is it something that maybe it'll be better at in the future? Just give us a sense of like what's actually the capability with GenAI plus trends and all this.
Sure. So the way that I've seen it done in companies that know what they're doing is that they will have some kind of like BI tool or some kind of like data analysis tool that is doing all of the ETL, the extract and transform and load of that data. It's doing the data analysis. And in order to interact with that tool, they might use a generative model to send commands to it. So let's say that I have a Copilot powered by GPT-4 or something, and it's attached to a database via some, software in between, because the generative models, they can't actually communicate with anything else unless you build that connection, right? So something to process the commands that's sending it to. I might ask GPT, what is the profit for 2015 of this company or something. And you've given it, the system engineers have hopefully given it the option of communicating with one of these other systems in your company's infrastructure, saying, okay, GPT, this is the user's query. Secondly, here are the tools that you have access to. One of them is a database, one of them is a dictionary, one of them is like a web search tool or something. Which one do you want to use? And under the hood, the generative model will choose, I need to talk to the database. Okay, now that we've established that, what is the command that you want to send to the database in order to answer the user's query? So it'll generate a command. That software will then take that command to the database, run it, bring it back, and then give that data to the generative model, be like, hey, I have this data now, what do I do with it? And it'll say, oh, you can visualize it using a command like this. So then that supporting software, once again, not the generative model, will create the table, which is a visualization, stick it into the chat window, and then it looks to the user like they've asked GPT a question and it answered it. But in reality, it was a combination of 3 different tools, the supporting software, the database, and the generative model, and something that's actually parsing the commands in order to make that happen. There's a lot going on under the hood, and it makes it look like these generative models are capable of more than they are, but that's how that would go. And the way that current companies that like I said, know what they're doing, instead of having the generative model create the command, they actually have a set list of things that the generative model is allowed to choose, and they've already pre-written the queries for those. So what is the profit for 2015? In the software architecture, somebody has already written out the query, this database, just fill in the year and the column name that you want, and then it'll handle the rest, instead of trusting it to a generative model, because they tend to also be kind of bad at these.
Listen, not everyone can be good at everything.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
So let's just briefly talk about the what not to do. So can you give us an example of, maybe we mentioned the horrors earlier.
Yes.
What could go wrong when a GPT model or a generative AI asset is used incorrectly, let's say?
Yeah, so there was a lot of excitement when GPT came out, GPT-3, about replacing all the old chatbot architectures, because, oh my gosh, now we have this thing that can talk to users and it can load our company's data or be trained on it or something like that. So there was one horror story that came out last month, and I knew this was going to happen at some point. I always tell my clients, please,
he knows when the horrors are coming.
Please don't make a chatbot using generative AI. I mean, you can use generative AI to support a chatbot, but you can't use it to replace one, and this is why. So Air Canada implemented a chatbot that's based on a generative model, and what the generative model did was promise to a user that it could get a refund, and it stated some refund policy that was totally made up. So it turns out that Air Canada hadn't really done their due diligence on this. They hadn't tested it adequately to make sure that it wouldn't come up with random stuff. And the guy got in contact with customer support from Air Canada, was rejected, and cited what the chatbot had provided him, and went to court about it. And Air Canada lost. So they didn't have to pay very much. It was only like $800 something. But still, it shows you, there are so many things that could go wrong with a system of like a person or a generative model just coming up with whatever information they want and it not being checked on the input and output. So if you're not careful, if you don't put guardrails in place, then things like this will continue to happen.
So it's still good to have a human in the mix.
Yeah.
Not relying on the robots completely just yet.
Exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's so many myths and misconceptions out there, and if we can even just bust a few of them, I think we're doing
it's honestly
here.
One of my favorite things to talk about. So
So thank you everyone for tuning in to today's episode of The Generative Edge.
Thank you much. Stay tuned, and we'll continue to bring you the latest news and events in the world of generative AI.
Yes, until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and stay on the bleeding edge of this technology. Thank you for listening to The Generative Edge, a Deloitte Central Europe and AWS production. Your hosts are Brandon Eychaner, Vyasaraj Kulkarni, and Donovan Sprunk. Our show is executive produced by Stephanie Cohen, Vanch Luthra, Ian Masters, and the Deloitte studio in Prague. Head writers are Stephanie Cohen and Brandon Eychaner. Our sound and audio engineer is Wojtek Krasa, who also serves as our editor and videographer. Michal Trusina is our graphic designer. Our marketing and social media are managed by Stephanie Cohen and the Deloitte studio in Prague. And our theme song was written and produced by Jakub Vlašek. Don't forget to rate and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.